This is a brief introduction to our article, Organizational Governance and Trade-offs Between Pay and Subjective Employee Well-Being, a Comparative Analysis. This project is in honor of David Marsden, who was a distinguished professor of employment relations and socioeconomics before his sudden death in 2021. We seek to honor David by advancing his theorizing and analyses from one of his last published articles. To set the stage, start with the worker. Based on that worker's education and experience, there's an average market rate of pay they could obtain in the labor market. But work is multidimensional, and workers value non-pecuniary intrinsic rewards too. Suppose this worker is considering a specific offer of a new job or a promotion in which they are willing to accept less than their market rate of pay in return for higher intrinsic rewards. Because this trade-off is hard to write into an employment contract, and because intrinsic rewards can be hard to observe, the worker might be concerned that the employer would renege on a promise of higher intrinsic rewards, which would leave the worker only with lower pay. The traditional solution to this problem assumes that an organization will live up to its promise in order to maintain a good reputation in the labor market.
Your reputation follows you wherever you go. Don't get a bad reputation.
David, however, theorized that an organization's ownership structure provides a stable, easy-to-observe signal of the likelihood of breaching the implicit contract. No, not beach, breach. We refined David's emphasis on ownership to create three dimensions of governance: financial ownership, control rights, and organizational purpose. The theory is then that employees will be more skeptical of realizing promised intrinsic rewards in publicly traded corporations, private equity-owned companies, and transactional-oriented public sector organizations like the Department of Motor Vehicles, and more confident that an implicit contract will be fulfilled in nonprofits, NGOs, and mission-oriented public sector organizations like public education and public health. Consequently, one should observe more of a trade-off between pay and subjective well-being, that is, between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards, in the latter type of organizations. To analyze this, worker-level data can be used as long as there are three measures. First, a measure of organizational governance. Second, a measure of compensatory pay. We follow David in interpreting a worker's residual from a log pay regression as a compensating earnings differential. That is, we assume that a worker's actual pay reflects a choice to deviate from obtainable average earnings to get higher pay to compensate for a lack of intrinsic amenities, captured by a positive residual in the regression, or to accept lower pay in return for higher unobservable positive amenities, captured by a negative residual. The third data requirement is one or more measures of subjective well-being. David used data from the British Workplace Employment Relations Survey and focused on comparing the average bundle of compensatory pay and different measures of subjective well-being, like job satisfaction, across different governance types. We can plot one of his key results, which makes it clear that workers in private sector corporations and transactional-oriented public sector agencies have higher average levels of compensatory pay, but lower average levels of satisfaction, compared to nonprofits, charities, and mission-oriented public sector agencies. These results are consistent with workers being willing to accept greater trade-offs between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards in certain governance regimes. But do these results hold in a different data set and in a broader context? This is one of the main aims of our own study. Conveniently, the European Working Conditions Survey fulfills the three criteria needed. We end up with a data set of around 23,000 workers across 35 European countries. For these workers, we can observe whether they work in one of 9 governance categories. We measure compensatory pay using each worker's residual from a standard log pay regression, as described a moment ago. And there are multiple measures of subjective well-being in the EWCS. For example, a multi-item measure we call intrinsically rewarding work. So, pooling across all 35 countries in our EWCS dataset, do we see a pattern of differential trade-offs between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards across different governance types? Drum roll, please. The short answer is yes. Private sector corporations and transactional-oriented public sector agencies have higher average levels of compensatory pay, but lower average levels of intrinsically rewarding work compared to public education and nonprofits. These two latter averages are statistically different from the private profit-oriented average in both the pay and intrinsic dimensions. We can construct similar graphs for regression-adjusted differences where we control for country fixed effects, presence of a union, number of employees, and some other things. The pattern of results is similar. The results are also similar for a work engagement measure of subjective well-being. But what about mission-oriented organizations in the private sector, such as privately owned schools or healthcare facilities? Is the extrinsic-intrinsic trade-off more like that in other areas of the private sector or in other mission-oriented organizations? In our results, it is more like other mission-oriented organizations. This highlights the importance of purpose in theorizing governance effects, and that governance in this context embodies a more general value orientation rather than simply ownership. We believe that this is an important extension to David's earlier paper. Another advancement on David's work is to take advantage of the breadth of the EWCS data to undertake a comparative analysis, as David often did in his own scholarship. One way to do this is to compare liberal market and coordinated market economies from the varieties of capitalism typology. The former category features a strong shareholder orientation with short time horizons and weak labor market institutions, all of which should magnify worker skepticism that organizations, especially those that are profit or transaction oriented, will fulfill promises of intrinsic rewards in lieu of pay. So we predict a wider range of extrinsic-intrinsic trade-offs in LMEs compared to CMEs. Moreover, the relatively greater strength of pro-worker institutions combined with market-insulated governance arrangements and patient capital in CMEs are predicted to give workers greater power to achieve higher levels of subjective well-being across all governance categories relative to those in LME countries. Consistent with our theorizing, we find a wider spread of trade-offs across governance types in LMEs, while also finding higher levels of average subjective well-being across all governance types in CMEs. In conclusion, David contended that governance models are signals within the labor market, enabling workers to make choices about the kind of work they're going to be doing, the kind of intrinsic benefits that they'll get, and what they can perhaps feel confident about sacrificing in terms of extrinsic rewards, knowing that governance is a fairly stable thing. We find supportive evidence of this across 35 European countries. These results further add to the literature on the impact of institutions on work and well-being, and can help academics and advocates consider what kind of institutional arrangements can best promote a broader array of societal objectives. Advocates for improving work often focus on work-related laws and institutions such as unions, but we shouldn't overlook the need to reform the shareholder value model of corporate governance too. Those interested in promoting enhanced worker well-being, as David was, should be casting a wide net of institutional change. All 35 countries in our EWCS dataset, do we see a pattern of differential trade-offs between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards across different... Wait, what?
Oh, come on!
Darned intrinsic narratives trying to take over again.
You better run!